Touch him again, she said, her voice low and absolute, cutting through the noise of the entire bar like a blade through silence, and you will see the other side of me. The three men turned and looked at her, this curvy, tattooed, dark-skinned woman standing between them, and their target with the stillness of someone who had already decided how this was going to end, and they laughed. That was the last mistake they ever made in that bar. The first man reached out to shove the stranger again, and before his hand connected, Natasha moved. He hit the table so hard the glasses on the next one rattled. The second came at her swinging. She caught his arm, twisted it to an angle that made him cry out, and drove him face first into the bar counter with a crack that stopped every conversation in the room cold. The third tried to run. She caught him by the collar without even turning fully around, dragged him back, and put him on the floor with one strike so clean and final that he sat there blinking up at her like he couldn't understand what had just happened. Then she straightened, smoothed her sleeve down her tattooed arm, and turned to face the man she had just saved, who was standing perfectly still, chest barely moving, dark eyes fixed on her with an expression that was not fear, not shock, not even simple gratitude. It was something older than all of those things. Something that looked, terrifyingly, like recognition. Welcome to Afro on Tales Besties. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing stories like this. The bar was still. Every person in it, the bartender with his hand frozen on a glass, the couple at the corner table, the two men by the door who had been arguing about football 30 seconds ago, was staring at Natasha Okafor like they had never seen anything like her before. And maybe they hadn't. She was standing in the middle of three unconscious men, chest rising and falling steadily, one tattooed arm relaxed at her side, the other braced on the bar counter with the casual authority of someone who had not broken a sweat. The jazz was still playing. Nobody had thought to turn it off. The man she had saved hadn't moved either. He was watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes, this quiet, well-dressed stranger with an arm he had been favoring all evening, and there was something in the way he was looking at her that made Natasha feel, for the first time in a long time, like her strength was not a problem to be solved. She looked away first. Old habit. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her Lagos accent rounding the edges of her English. He blinked, as if the question surprised him. "No," he said. Then, quieter, "Because of you." She studied him for one more second, measured, direct, then picked up her bag from the bar stool where she had left it before the whole thing started. The bar was still watching. She was used to being watched. She was used to the looks that came after, the unease, the whispered commentary, the careful distance people put between themselves and a woman who fought like that. What she was not used to was a man who looked at her the way this one did. Not afraid. Not uncomfortable. Just steady. Like he was standing in the middle of a storm and finding it, somehow, beautiful. "You should get that arm looked at," she said, nodding at the way he was holding it. "Sit with me first," he said. "Let me buy you a drink." She hesitated. She had been about to leave the way she always left after scenes like this, quietly, before the stares curdled into judgment. But something about the stillness of him kept her feet on the floor. "One drink," she said. "Then I go home." She did not know yet that one drink would change everything. She did not know his name, or what he ran, or why a man like him had been sitting alone in a bar like this without a single guard in sight. She did not know that the chapter of her life that had sent her running to this city on the other side of the world was about to collide with something brand new. All she knew was that he was the first person all evening who had looked at her like she had done something right. That, for Natasha Okafor, was rarer than it should have been. And to understand why, to understand the woman standing in that soul bar with tattoos on her arms and fire in her eyes, you had to go back. All the way back to Lagos, where her story really began. Her name had always been too loud for the spaces people tried to put her in. Natasha Okafor. 28 years old. Lagos born and raised. The kind of woman that mothers in her neighborhood pointed at when they wanted to teach their daughters what not to be. Too strong. Too direct. Too unafraid of the things that were supposed to frighten her. She walked through Lagos the way she walked through everything, spine straight, shoulders squared, tattoos tracing bold patterns up both forearms and winding toward her collarbone, eyes that held a steadiness most people spent years training out of themselves. "No man will ever marry that one," the women in the market said when she passed. "She behaves like a man," the neighbors said. "She is too much," everyone said. "Too loud. Too hard. Too much." She had heard it so often the words had stopped stinging somewhere around her 22nd year. Now they were simply background noise, the Lego soundtrack that ran beneath the heat and the traffic and the smell of suya on open grills. She did not enjoy being feared. What she enjoyed was peace. And if the price of peace was the reputation she carried, she would pay it without complaint. It was on a Thursday afternoon that the trouble started near the market. 3 boys harassing a woman selling groundnuts, calling her names that no human being deserved to hear, while the woman's hands shook and her eyes stayed down because she needed to sell those groundnuts to feed her children that evening. Nobody moved to help. Nobody ever did. Natasha set down her bag of tomatoes, walked over, and in under 30 seconds, the 3 boys were gone, one clutching his wrist, all of them suddenly very busy somewhere else. The groundnut seller looked up at her with grateful, uncertain eyes. Nobody else thanked her. They muttered. They shook their heads. A woman nearby said loudly to her friend, "You see why no man will marry that one. Imagine bringing something like that home to your family." Natasha picked up her tomatoes and kept walking. She had stopped waiting for thank yous the same year she stopped waiting for apologies. That evening at home, she was different. Her mother, Mrs. Helen Okafor, sat in the small living room watching her evening program, and Natasha cooked jollof rice, fried plantain, the way her mother liked it. She hummed softly. She brought a plate to her mother and sat beside her, and Mrs. Helen patted her hand with the tenderness of a woman who had always seen the soft thing living underneath her daughter's steel. "You are a good girl," Mrs. Helen said. Natasha rested her head briefly on her mother's shoulder. Just for a moment. Just long enough to remember that she was loved somewhere. "I know, Mama." The Nigerian army had made Natasha what she was, and it had also broken something in her that she had spent years trying to repair. She had enlisted at 21, one of the few women in her unit, and she had been better than most of the men, faster, sharper, more disciplined. She had loved the structure of it. The purpose. The feeling that her strength was finally pointed at something worthy. The mission in the northeastern bush had been classified. 7 of them went in. In the chaos of an ambush, real, brutal, close range, her unit had pulled back. She had been separated by 200 meters. They had left without her. She survived 3 days alone in hostile terrain, injured, rationing water, using every skill she had ever been taught. When she walked back into base on the 3rd day, the commander had looked at her with something between relief and discomfort. There was no medal, no commendation, no acknowledgement that she had done something extraordinary. There was only a conversation about unit cohesion and a quiet suggestion that perhaps she was better suited to a different assignment. She had left the army 6 months later, carrying her discharge papers and a rage she did not yet know what to do with. Then there was Kingsley. He had come into her life the way unexpected things do, sideways, when she was looking somewhere else. He was a teacher, soft-spoken, warm-eyed, the kind of man who remembered small things. He had looked at Natasha and seen her, not the reputation, not the tattoos, not the force of her personality. Just her. For 2 years, she had allowed herself to be loved. She had laughed more than she had in years. She had let her guard down, degree by careful degree, and she had been happy in the quiet, uncomplicated way that people are happy before something shatters it. Kingsley's family had other plans. She met them once. Just once was enough. His mother had sat across from her with a smile that did not reach her eyes and said, carefully, "We are just concerned that a woman with your temperament will have difficulty in a marriage. Our son needs a peaceful home." His aunt had been less diplomatic. "This one will beat our son. I have seen women like this. They are too strong. They do not submit." Kingsley had said nothing. He had sat at that table and let the silence speak on his behalf, and Natasha had understood, with the same cold clarity she had used to survive 3 days in hostile terrain, that she was on her own again. She had stood, thanked them for their time in a voice as calm as still water, walked out and not looked back. She had cried exactly once, alone, in her bathroom, the tap running so her mother would not hear. Then she had packed a suitcase, called a travel agent, and bought a one-way ticket to Seoul, South Korea. Seoul in March was cold and clean and entirely indifferent to Natasha's history, which was exactly what she needed. She found a small apartment in Mapogu, took a language class, and got a job at a logistics company where her English and her sharp organizational mind made her immediately useful. She covered her tattoos with long sleeves. She spoke quietly. She smiled when people were rude, swallowed her instinct to correct injustice, and told herself that this was growth. It did not feel like growth. It felt like shrinking. A colleague at work, a man named Park Dae-jong, persistent and increasingly familiar, had started leaving coffee on her desk with notes that she had not asked for. When he stood too close during the elevator rides, she stepped away. When he made comments about how exotic she was, she smiled and said nothing. The Natasha who had grown up in Lagos would have ended that in 3 words. The Natasha in Seoul walked to her apartment that evening and stood in front of her bathroom mirror for a long time, looking at the woman reflected back at her, trying to figure out where she had gone. It was a Saturday evening in early April when everything changed. She had gone to a bar 2 streets from her apartment, a low-lit, unpretentious place that served good beer and played jazz at a volume that allowed for thinking. She went there when she needed to sit somewhere that wasn't her own walls and feel like a person in a world rather than a ghost haunting a foreign city. She was on her 2nd drink when she noticed them. 3 men. Young, loud, the specific kind of drunk that makes people careless and cruel. They had found a young man near the far end of the counter, quietly dressed, sitting alone, one hand resting strangely against his side, face neutral in the way of a person who has decided not to escalate. The touts were poking him, taking his drink, saying things that made 2 nearby tables look away with studied disinterest. Natasha watched. Her jaw tightened. She watched for 45 seconds, counting, giving the bar staff time to intervene. Nobody moved. She set down her glass. "Touch him again," she said, her voice cutting through the jazz and the bar noise like a blade, "and you will see the other side of me." The 3 men turned. They looked at her, this woman with dark eyes, tattoos peeking beneath her rolled sleeve, a stillness about her that should have been a warning, and they laughed. "Who is this one?" the tallest said, in Korean, grinning at his friends. He reached out and shoved the quiet man's shoulder again, deliberately, looking straight at Natasha. She moved. What happened in the next 12 seconds would be described differently by everyone in the bar, depending on who they told the story to. But the essential facts were these. The first man went into a table with enough force to rattle the glasses on the next one. The second found his arm locked at an angle that made him very still and very cooperative. The third made the mistake of trying to come at her from behind and discovered that she had already anticipated this, turned, and introduced his face to the bar counter with a firm, decisive efficiency that left him seated on the floor looking confused. The entire bar was silent. Natasha straightened, smoothed her sleeve down, looked around the room. Nobody spoke. She turned to the quiet man she had defended, who was standing very still, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes that held something she had never seen directed at her before. Not fear. Not shock, exactly. Something closer to recognition. His name was Han Min-soo. And he was not, in any ordinary sense of the word, a man who needed saving. He ran the Han Syndicate, the most powerful criminal organization in Seoul, with reach extending into Busan, Tokyo, and 3 cities in mainland China. He had 300 people who answered to him, a network that made the city's politicians nervous, and a reputation that had been built, deliberately and carefully, over 11 years of strategic violence and strategic restraint. He had gone out alone that Saturday evening for the first time in 4 years. It had been a foolish decision, and he had known it before he made it. But there are moments, even in the lives of powerful men, when the armor becomes too heavy to breathe in, and he had needed, desperately, to sit somewhere as a person rather than a symbol. The gunshot wound his left forearm, sustained 3 weeks earlier in a confrontation with the Cha faction. His primary rival was still healing. It had been dressed and cleaned, and the doctor had said another 2 weeks. In any other situation, he would have had 4 men within arm's reach, and the matter in that bar would never have escalated to a point that required intervention. But he was alone, and his arm was not functional, and the 3 men had found him at a moment when he was genuinely, unusually, vulnerable. And then she had appeared. He watched her dismantle 3 men in 12 seconds with the calm efficiency of someone who had been trained for exactly this. Not bar fights, not civilian brawling, but genuine, disciplined combat. The angle of her movements. The way she had accounted for all 3 before the first one even hit the table. The complete absence of rage in her face while she did it. Military training, he thought. Recent. High level. When she turned to look at him, he felt something move in his chest. He could not name it, and he was not accustomed to things he could not name. "Are you injured?" she asked, in English, her accent placing her somewhere West African. He realized he had been staring. "No," he said. "Then, because of you." She looked at him steadily. "Someone should have stepped in sooner." "Yes," he agreed. "They should have." She picked up her bag from the bar stool where she had left it, apparently preparing to simply leave, as if she had not just reordered the entire environment of the room. "Let me buy you a drink," he said. "To replace the one that got disrupted." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark, direct eyes that gave nothing away except intelligence. She hesitated, he insisted. "1 drink," she said. "Then I go home." He almost smiled. Of course. He did not tell her his name that night. Not his real name. He told her he was a businessman. She told him she worked in logistics. They sat at a corner table while the bar slowly returned to its normal noise around them, and they talked for 2 hours about Seoul, about Lagos, about the particular experience of being somewhere that is not home and finding it surprisingly freeing. She was sharp. Funny in a dry, effortless way. She spoke with a directness that most people spent years training out of themselves, and she wore it naturally, without apology. He asked for her number before she left. She gave it to him, which surprised her more than it surprised him. If you're enjoying this story so far, besties, hit that like button and drop a comment below. Have you ever had someone step in and save you at your vulnerable moments? Let us know. The next day, he sent a car. Not a message. A car, sleek, black, with a driver who handed her a note that said simply, "Dinner tonight. I know a good place. M." Natasha stood at her apartment door in her bathrobe holding the note and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, flustered. She told herself she wouldn't go. She got dressed anyway. The restaurant was quiet and expensive and overlooked the Han River, and Han Min-soo was already seated when she arrived, dressed simply, his injured arm resting easily on the table. He stood when she entered. His eyes moved over her once, just once, and the expression in them was controlled, but not completely. She noticed. She was trained to notice. "You dressed up," he said. "I was already dressed," she said, sitting down. He almost smiled again. She was beginning to understand that with him, almost smiles were the equivalent of other men's laughter. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. He called. She answered, not always, not immediately, just enough to keep the conversation going because the conversation was genuinely interesting and she was genuinely lonely, and she had not yet allowed herself to acknowledge either of those things fully. He noticed the soft act. It was at their 4th dinner that he set down his glass and looked at her with a directness that mirrored her own and said, "You don't have to do that around me." She stilled. "Do what?" "Make yourself smaller. Softer. Whatever it is you think you need to be in order for people to accept you here." He paused. "I met the real version of you first. In that bar. I'd rather keep talking to her." The silence between them stretched. Natasha felt something shift, something deep and structural, the kind of shift that happens when a wall you have been maintaining for years develops the first crack. "You don't know anything about the real version of me," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I'd like to," she told him. Not everything at once, she was not built for that, but in pieces, over dinners and walks along the river and one afternoon in a small cafe where rain hammered the windows and made the world feel smaller and safer. The military. The mission. The abandonment. The silence afterward. Lagos, and the way a society could make a person feel like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. Kingsley. She kept that one brief, just the essential shape of it, but he heard it. She could tell by the way his jaw set slightly when she mentioned the family gathering where she had been evaluated and found lacking. They were afraid of you, he said. They were disgusted by me. Fear and disgust look the same from the outside, he said. The difference is what's underneath. Disgust is just discomfort dressed up. People are disgusted by what challenges them. He looked at her. You challenged every idea they had about what a woman was supposed to be. Natasha looked at her hands. At the tattoos that had marked her as other for so many years. Does that bother you? She asked. Quietly. More quietly than she had intended. No, he said. And the flatness of it, the complete absence of qualification, landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. It was another week before she learned who he really was. She arrived at his apartment, a penthouse in Gangnam that she had assumed belonged to a very successful businessman, and found 3 men in suits in the hallway who straightened when she appeared and who she immediately clocked as security rather than employees. He was on the phone when she entered, speaking in rapid Korean, and the conversation was clearly not about logistics. She caught specific words, territory, faction, message, and her military brain assembled the picture with quiet efficiency. When he ended the call and turned to find her watching him, he knew immediately that she had understood. He told her the truth. Fully, without softening it. Han Min-soo. The Han Syndicate. 11 years. The scope and the reach, and the specific kind of power that made certain rooms go quiet. Natasha listened without interrupting. When he finished, the silence held for 10 seconds. Do you hurt innocent people? She asked. No. That's a line. That has always been the line. Another silence. She looked at him carefully, reading him the way she had learned to read terrain and people in the army, looking for the truth beneath the presentation. Then we have no problem, she said. But if that ever changes, we're done. Something in his face softened. Just barely. Just for a moment. Understood, he said. The first complication arrived in the form of Park Dae-young from her office. He had, over the weeks, escalated from coffee notes to showing up at her building, and she had run out of diplomatic patience. She handled it quietly, a short, unambiguous conversation in the office lobby that left him pale and her colleagues looking at her with wide eyes and thought nothing more of it. Min-soo heard about it. She was not sure how, but she was learning that very little happened within 3 kilometers of her without Min-soo eventually hearing about it. He said nothing directly. But the next day Park Dae-young was transferred to the Busan office, and when she confronted Min-soo about it at dinner that evening, the expression on his face was entirely composed and not even slightly apologetic. I didn't ask you to do that, she said. No, he agreed. It wasn't your business to handle. No, he agreed again. Then, I handled it anyway. She stared at him. Min-soo. He was making you uncomfortable. That makes him my problem. I am not something you own. No, he said, and his voice was quieter now, something genuine underneath the control. You're something I care about. There's a difference. She wanted to be angry. The anger kept slipping out of reach. Don't do that again without telling me first, she said finally. I'll try, he said, which was the most honest answer he could have given. 2 weeks later, the Cha faction made their move. Natasha had been walking home from the market on a Tuesday evening when the van pulled up. 2 men got out. She had 3 seconds of warning, the van's engine pattern, the way they were dressed, the specific quality of their movement, and she used all 3. She took down the first one before he reached her. The second got hold of her for 4 seconds before she broke the grip and put him on the ground. A third she had not seen came from a doorway, and she took a blow to the side of her head that sent the world sideways. She woke in a room. Concrete. One light. Her hands zip-tied behind her. She spent 30 seconds assessing exits, guard positions, structural weaknesses, what she had on her body that could be useful. She found 2 things useful. She was out of the zip tie in 4 minutes, using a technique she had been taught in a basement training facility in Kaduna by a woman who had laughed while teaching it. She was out of the room in 7. She moved through the building with the same quiet efficiency she had used in the northeastern bush, fast, low, decisive. She walked out of the warehouse and called Min-soo from a phone she had taken off the unconscious guard. He picked up before the second ring. She read the street sign visible from where she stood. Songdong-gu, near the rail depot. I'm fine. I need a ride. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. Don't move, he said. His voice was the flattest she had ever heard it. I'm coming. He arrived in 11 minutes with 4 men and an expression on his face that she had never seen before, and she realized, looking at him, that she was seeing what Han Min-soo looked like when something had genuinely frightened him. He crossed her immediately, his hands moving to her face, turning it carefully to examine the bruise forming at her temple, his jaw so tight it looked like stone. I'm fine, she said. You have a bruise the size of my hand on your face. I've had worse. Natasha. His voice broke slightly on the second syllable. Just slightly. Just enough. She caught his hands in hers and held them still. I got out. I'm standing here. I'm fine. She met his eyes. Now, let's find out who sent them. The interrogation of the captured men revealed 2 things. The first was that they belonged to the Cha faction. This, Min-soo had expected. The second was that the faction had been provided with Natasha's full profile, her home address, her daily routine, and her real identity, including her Nigerian army service record, her discharge, and the specific mission in the Northeast. The person who had assembled that file was not a Korean crime operative. The person who had assembled that file had been in Nigeria, and was now in Seoul. She saw him on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after the kidnapping attempt. Kingsley. He was standing outside her office building, dressed well, looking like the most composed version of himself. When he saw her, his face arranged itself into something between remorse and relief. Tasha, he said. She stopped walking. Her body had gone very still in the way it did when it was preparing for something. Kingsley, she said. I've been looking for you for 2 months. He stepped closer. I made a mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. I know that now. She studied him, the familiar face, the eyes she had once trusted absolutely. Something moved in her chest. Not love. Not anymore. Something older and more complicated. The memory of pain. Why are you in Seoul? She asked. Because you're in Seoul, he said simply. Where else would I be? She did not tell Min-soo immediately. Not because she was hiding it, she told herself that, but because she needed to understand her own reaction first. She was not in love with Kingsley anymore. She was certain of that. But his presence had reopened the room where she kept her deepest wound, and she needed to sit with that alone before she brought it to someone else. Min-soo noticed the shift in her within 24 hours. What happened? He asked. Nothing. The look he gave her said clearly that he did not believe her and was choosing not to push for now. A few days later, he found out anyway. She was not sure who from his network had seen them, her and Kingsley, talking outside a cafe she had agreed to meet him at, hoping to close the chapter cleanly, but Min-soo called that evening and his voice had a quality she had not heard before. Careful. Controlled. Something underneath the control that was not quite calm. Who is he? She told him. All of it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence was long enough that she thought for a moment he might not respond. He's staying in Seoul? Min-soo said. He says so. Another silence. And what do you want? She thought about it, genuinely, honestly. Nothing from him. That chapter is closed. She heard him exhale slowly. Just once. All right, he said. But Kingsley was not in Seoul simply for love. Min-soo's intelligence team discovered it first. Kingsley Adeyemi had been approached 3 weeks before arriving in Seoul by a contact working for the Cha faction. He had been offered money, a clean identity, and safe passage in exchange for one thing, information on Natasha Okafor, the woman now connected to Han Min-soo. Her background, her weaknesses, her patterns. Her military record, which Kingsley, who had known her in her post-army years, could describe in specific, useful detail. He had taken the money. And then, perhaps eaten by guilt, perhaps calculating that proximity to Natasha might yield further value, he had come to Seoul and stood outside her building and called it love. When Min-soo presented the evidence to Natasha, setting the file on the table between them without comment, she sat with it for a long time. She did not cry. She had expected to. She did not. What she felt was something past the reach of tears, a cold, clarifying anger that settled in her bones and made the world very sharp and very clear. He gave them my army record, she said. Yes. He's the reason they knew where I lived. Yes. She closed the file, straightened, set her hands flat on the table. I want to talk to him, she said. Natasha, I want to look at him, and I want him to know that I know. Her voice was quiet, completely steady. That's all I need. Besties, if Kingsley were your ex, what would you have done? Drop your answer in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video. The confrontation with Kingsley happened on a gray Friday morning in the lobby of his hotel. She found him at breakfast, reading his phone. He looked up when she sat across from him, and whatever he saw in her face made his expression change. She slid the file across the table. One photograph, one transaction record. That was all she needed. He looked at it. He looked at her. Tasha, I can explain. Don't, she said. Please. Don't explain to me. Her voice was even. Clear. Like water over stone. You were the one person in my entire life who saw me and chose me. And then when it cost you something, you chose yourself. I accepted that. I left and I healed and I built something new. She held his gaze. But then you came here. And you used the one person who actually loves me, who has never once asked me to be less than I am, as a tool for your own agenda. And that, she said, I will not accept. Kingsley's face had gone gray. I was trying to get back to you. I thought if he was gone. You thought you could remove him, and I would come back to you. She shook her head slowly. You never understood me at all. The man who loves me because of exactly who I am. You wanted someone different. You always did. She stood. We are done. Completely and permanently. And if I find out you've had any further contact with the Cha faction, I will handle it personally. She left without looking back. The Cha faction moved against Min-soo 10 days later. They had been building toward it. The kidnapping attempt on Natasha had been a probe, an attempt to destabilize Min-soo by threatening what was clearly most important to him. When that failed, they escalated. The attack came on 3 fronts simultaneously: his business interests in Gangnam, his second-in-command's location in Mapogu, and the one they had calculated would bring him to a halt, his penthouse. It was a calculated move. It was also a mistake, because they had not fully accounted for Natasha. She had been at the penthouse when the first signal came through. Min-soo's security system, a 3-tone sequence she had learned meant immediate threat. She moved before the guards finished processing it, securing the east entrance, directing 2 of Min-soo's men to positions she had identified in her first week at the building as the most tactically sound. Min-soo arrived 40 minutes later to find the situation managed, his home secured, and Natasha sitting calmly at the kitchen counter with a bandage on her forearm where a graze had caught her and a cup of tea. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her. Your east entrance has a blind spot, she said. I've fixed it temporarily, but you'll need to look at your surveillance coverage. He crossed the room in 4 strides, pulled her up from the stool, and held her not gently, the way people hold fragile things, but fiercely, both arms around her, his face in her hair, breathing hard. She didn't pull away. She held him back, just as hard. What came next was the full engagement, 3 days of coordinated operations across Seoul, Min-soo's network moving with the controlled ferocity that had built his empire, and Natasha at the center of the strategic planning. Her military training applied to a different kind of war, but with the same precision. She had told him she would not hurt innocent people. Neither would he. The war was clean, targeted, and decisive. On the second day, something unexpected surfaced. In the intelligence pulled from the Cha faction's operations center, there was a name. Colonel Bacha. Nigerian Army. Former unit commander. The same man who had ordered the retreat that left Natasha alone in the bush 7 years ago. He had been in Seoul for 11 months, operating as a private security consultant, and for the last 4, as a paid strategist for the Cha faction, providing tactical analysis and, because he had recognized Natasha's name in faction briefings, specific intelligence about her military capabilities and psychological profile. He had known she was here. He had chosen to weaponize her again rather than acknowledge what he had done 7 years ago. Natasha received this information alone, in the war room, after Minsu's team set the file in front of her. She sat with it for 2 full minutes. Then she stood and walked to the door and said to the man waiting outside, "Tell Minsu I need a location." She confronted Colonel Bacha in a warehouse on the eastern edge of the city, on the 3rd day of the war, with Minsu's men securing the perimeter and Minsu himself standing 6 feet behind her, not in front of her, not between her and what she needed, but behind, present, available, hers to call on if she needed him. She had told him that was where she needed him. He had listened. Bacha was older than she remembered. His face had the look of a man who had made calculations all his life and was doing it now, assessing her, the room, the exits, his odds. "Private Okafor," he said. "That's not my rank and this isn't your army," she said. "You left me in the bush for 3 days. I survived. I came home. And instead of acknowledging that, you erased it. And then you followed me here and used the story of what you did to me against me." He had nothing to say to that. She had not expected him to. "You don't get an apology from me," she said. "I stopped needing one a long time ago. What I needed was to stand in front of you and let you see that everything you thought was weakness in me was actually just something you were too small to understand." She looked at him steadily. "I survived you. I survived everything after you. And I am standing here without any of the scars you were supposed to leave." She stepped back. She looked at Minsu. "I'm done," she said. He came to her side immediately. The war ended on a Thursday. The Cha faction's leadership structure collapsed under the coordinated pressure. Colonel Bacha was delivered to a contact at the Nigerian embassy with a detailed dossier of his activities, his abandonment of his unit, his illegal consulting work, his involvement in organized crime. She did not need violence for his reckoning. She needed the truth on record. Minsu's empire emerged from the 3 days stronger than it had entered, enemies neutralized, alliances reinforced, a message sent so clearly that it required no words. And Natasha Okafor, who had come to Seoul to make herself invisible, had ended the week more fully and completely herself than she had been since the day she left the army. 3 days later, she found him on the rooftop. It was just after midnight, the city laid out below in lights, the Han River a dark ribbon in the distance. He was standing at the edge with his back to her, jacket off despite the April cold, and she walked to him and stood beside him, and they were quiet together for a while. "I need to call my mother tomorrow," she said eventually. "Tell her hello from me," he said. She turned to look at him. "She doesn't know you exist. She will soon." The quiet that followed had a different quality, warmer, heavier. "You saved my life," he said. "Twice, if we're counting the bar." "You saved mine," she said. "In the ways that matter." He turned to face her then, and she looked at him, this man who had seen her at her most dangerous and her most vulnerable, and had chosen both versions without qualification, who had stood behind her when she needed him to and stepped forward when she needed that. And she felt the last piece of the wall come down. "I don't want to pretend anymore," she said. "Not here. Not with you." "You haven't been pretending," he said. "Not for a long time." He reached up and traced one of the tattoos on her forearm, the one that curled from her wrist to her elbow, slowly, deliberately, as if memorizing it. "You were never too much," he said. "The world you were in was just too small." His eyes found hers. "You are exactly the right amount of everything." She felt it land. Deep. True. All the way down. She had spent 8 years waiting for someone to say that and mean it. She had stopped expecting it. And then this man had walked into her life from the wrong end of a bar fight and said it so simply, so plainly, so completely, that there was nowhere left to hide from it. She stepped closer. He was still, waiting, the way he always waited for her, certain but never pushy, present but never consuming. "Minsu." Don't let me run, she said quietly. If I get scared and try to leave, don't let me. Something shifted in his face. The last of the composure, gone. Something real and undefended underneath. I will burn down every road you try to take, he said, and stand at the end of all of them, waiting. She laughed, a real one, the full, warm laugh that Mrs. Helen knew and that Lagos had tried to take from her. And Minsu, hearing it for the first time without any restraint in it, looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for all his life without knowing he was waiting. He pulled her close. She let him. 6 weeks later, Minsu flew Mrs. Helen Okafor to Seoul. Natasha didn't know until the car pulled up outside her building on a Sunday morning and the door opened and her mother stepped out, wrapped in her Ankara print, looking at the city with wide, delighted eyes, and then at her daughter, and then at the tall, serious Korean man standing slightly behind Natasha with an expression that any mother anywhere in the world would have recognized immediately. Mrs. Helen Okafor looked at Han Min-soo for a long moment. He bore it with complete composure. You love my daughter, Mrs. Helen said. It was not a question. Yes, ma'am, he said. And she is enough for you. As she is. She is more than enough, he said. She is the standard by which I judge everything else. Mrs. Helen turned to Natasha with shining eyes. This one, she said, keep him. Natasha laughed so hard she had to put her hand over her mouth. That evening, the three of them had dinner on the rooftop, Mrs. Helen talking with great enthusiasm about Seoul, Minsu listening with genuine attention and asking questions that made her mother beam, Natasha watching the two most important people in her life occupy the same space and feeling something settle into place in her chest. After dinner, while her mother had gone inside, she and Minsu sat at the rooftop edge again, shoulder to shoulder, the city below them. I need to go back to Lagos, she said. Not to stay. Just to close things properly. I'll come with you, he said. As simple as that. She looked at him. You're not afraid of Lagos. I'm not afraid of anything you're a part of, he said. Then, without changing his tone, move in here when we get back. She raised an eyebrow. That's your proposal? I can do it more formally if you prefer. Minsu. I have a ring, he said. I've had it for 3 weeks. I was waiting for the right moment. She stared at him. He looked back at her with those dark, steady eyes that had never once looked at her as though she was too much. Is this the right moment? He asked. She thought about Lagos and the voices. The market, the mirror, the bathroom floor where she had cried exactly once before deciding to live. The northeastern bush and 3 days alone and coming out the other side. The bar in Seoul, and 3 men, and a quiet stranger who had watched her with those eyes. She thought about the woman who had been told her entire life that she was more than the world could hold. And she looked at the man who had looked at her and said, not more than I can hold. More than I deserve. But mine. Yes, she said. This is the right moment. He took the ring from his pocket, simple, perfect, the kind of thing a person chooses when they know the other person rather than when they want to impress them, and slid it onto her finger, and she looked at it, and she felt what she felt. Full. Finally, completely, irreversibly full. Natasha Okafor had been told, for as long as she could remember, that she was too much. Too strong. Too fierce. Too unsubmissive. Too tattooed. Too scarred. Too loud in her existence. And she had taken all of that, every word, every rejection, every battle, and she had carried it across an ocean, and she had sat in a bar on a Saturday evening and decided, one last time, to be exactly who she was. And in doing so, she had saved a man who would go on to save her in return. She was not too much. She had never been too much. She had simply been looking for a space wide enough to hold her, and that space turned out to be the arms of a man who recognized, from 12 seconds of watching her fight, that she was not a problem to be managed. She was a force to stand beside. She found love not by changing herself, but by refusing to stay changed. She found peace not by surrendering her strength, but by meeting someone who saw her strength as the most beautiful thing about her. The world had said, tone it down. Han Min-soo had said, turn it all the way up. And Natasha Okafor, finally, beautifully, had listened to the right voice. And that, besties, is the end of Natasha and Min-soo's story. the woman they called too much. This story teaches us that there's always someone for everyone. Never try to shrink yourself just to be accepted by the society. If this story moved you, if Natasha reminded you of someone you know or someone you are, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Afrohan Tales so you never miss a story. Drop in the comments, what was your favorite moment? Was it the bar fight? Minsu meeting Mrs. Helen? Or the rooftop proposal? We read every single comment. And if you want more stories like this, fierce women, powerful love, and the kind of romance that doesn't ask you to be less than you are, then you are in exactly the right place. Until the next story, besties, take care of yourselves. This is Afrohan Tales, where love is never ordinary.